Imagine a 43-year-old man, someone who seemingly has everything he ever wanted. He has a solid career, a comfortable home, and the car he always dreamed of driving. On paper, his life seems perfect, but inside, something is broken. A deep feeling of dissatisfaction that he can't name, a restlessness that follows him with every step he takes, every day that passes. He wakes up early every day, puts on his suit, drinks his coffee, and heads to work. But as he drives through the streets he knows so well, he feels a growing emptiness. It's as if the weight of responsibilities and expectations is slowly suffocating the spark of life within him. He finds himself gazing at the horizon, searching for something more, something he can't find in his daily routines or professional successes. Gradually, this feeling begins to invade every aspect of his life. Conversations that once excited him now seem empty. Celebrations and achievements that once brought joy are now followed by a sense of discontent. He begins to wonder, is this it? Is this all life has to offer? He realizes that despite all his accomplishments, something is still missing, something he can't define but knows is essential. This dissatisfaction starts to grow like a shadow spreading over his life. What was once a slight discomfort has now become an urgency, a need to find answers. He feels that if he doesn't do something, this shadow will consume him, leaving him empty inside, even surrounded by all the things that should bring him happiness. One day, while silently having his breakfast, he finds himself staring at a picture he took years ago during a trip abroad. In the photo, he's smiling, but now he realizes that smile was only superficial. He looks into his own eyes in the image and sees the same restlessness he feels now. It's at that moment he decides he needs to do something different. He needs to step out of his comfort zone and seek answers to the dissatisfaction that consumes him. And so, an idea is born, an idea he had never considered before, but now it seems to be his only way out. He decides to take time for himself, to search for something beyond the boundaries of his current life. He's going to a place where the answers aren't in numbers, contracts, or meetings, but in something deeper, something he needs to discover. This is the beginning of his journey, a journey that he doesn't yet know will transform him forever. He is about to embark on a trip to Nepal, a place where he hopes to find the answers he seeks, and perhaps finally fill the void that has consumed him for so long. When our protagonist arrives in Nepal, he feels like he's entering a completely new world. The majestic mountains, ancient temples, and pure, fresh air all seem to invite him to delve deeper into his search. He follows his intuition to a remote monastery, a place hidden in the mountain slopes where time seems to have stopped. Upon entering the monastery, he is greeted by an elderly monk whose gaze is both gentle and penetrating, as if he can see directly into his soul. After a few simple exchanges, the monk invites him for a deeper conversation. They sit in a small monastery garden, surrounded by the soft sound of wind chimes and the scent of flowers blooming under the late afternoon sun. The man, still carrying the weight of his dissatisfaction, begins to talk about his life. He speaks of his achievements, all that he has built, and the deep sense of emptiness that has inexplicably taken over his existence. The monk listens in silence, without interrupting, until the man finishes venting, feeling slightly lighter for having shared his anguish. The monk pauses, as if carefully choosing his words, and then begins to speak. Have you ever wondered, young man, about the importance of your actions? Not just the big decisions, but every small act you carry out throughout the day. Every thought, every word, every choice you make. The man looks at him curiously, unsure of where the monk is going with this. Everything you do, the monk continues, generates a consequence, an energy that returns to you. This is the principle of karma. But what you may not have realized is that by avoiding taking responsibility for these actions, you create a cycle of mental weakness. When we deny ourselves the responsibility for our choices, we begin to lose control over our own lives. The man begins to recall all the times he avoided his responsibilities, all the times he let the fear of making mistakes or the desire to protect himself lead him to blame others for his own failures. He had never thought of it this way, but now he begins to realize that by doing so, He was weakening his own mind, creating a spiral of negativity that only increased his sense of helplessness. The monk then places his hand on the man's shoulder, a simple gesture, but one that carries great weight. If you truly wish to find peace and inner strength, you must start accepting responsibility for every aspect of your life. By doing so, you regain control, and with it, the ability to change what is not right. The man feels a chill run down his spine. For the first time, he understands that true mental strength does not come from resisting mistakes, but from the ability to take responsibility for them and learn from them. And there, in that monastery garden, he begins to see his life in a new light, realizing that his path to true peace begins with the complete acceptance of himself and his actions. After spending days at the monastery, absorbing every word of the wise monk, our protagonist begins to realize that the transformation he seeks will not come without effort. On a cold morning, as the sun barely begins to peek through the mountains, he finds himself once again in the garden, ready for the next lesson. The monk, as usual, arrives silently, his steps light on the earth, and sits beside the man. The monk starts the conversation with a simple question, but one that carries profound weight. Have you ever experienced the feeling of carrying an invisible weight, something you cannot see, but that seems to crush your spirit day after day? The man thinks for a moment, recalling all the times he felt a burning anger inside him, how it consumed him, and how he clung to it, unable to let it go. He knew what the monk was talking about, but he had never thought of it as a weight. He always saw anger as something external, a justified reaction to others' wrongdoings. The monk, sensing the man's internal struggle, continues, "When you hold on to anger and resentment, it's like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. The anger you feel, that grudge you carry, does not affect the person who hurt you. It only poisons your mind, darkens your heart, and in the end, weakens your soul." The man feels a lump in his throat. He remembers the times he stayed awake at night, brooding over grudges, replaying arguments, wishing the people who hurt him would feel the same pain he did. But in that moment, hearing the monk's words, he realizes that all this anger did was consume his energy, his peace, and his ability to move forward. "Imagine," says the monk, "that you are carrying a heavy stone in your hands. Each day you hold it tighter, with more force, hoping it will give you power or cause pain to those who hurt you. But in reality, that stone is only tearing your hands, tiring your arms, and bending your knees. True strength does not come from holding on to that stone, but from letting it go." The man can almost feel the weight of that imaginary stone in his hands. So real is the image the monk creates. He realizes that the anger and resentment he thought were sources of power were actually chains that kept him in a state of constant suffering. Releasing anger, the monk continues, is not about forgiving the unforgivable or forgetting what was done. It is, above all, an act of compassion for yourself. By releasing resentment, you free yourself from the prison you have built, and then you can finally begin to heal. The monk's words resonate in the man's heart. He feels tears start to form, not out of sadness, but out of relief. He had never understood that by holding on to anger, he was hurting himself. But now, in the silence of the mountains, he begins to realize that perhaps the key to his inner peace lies in the courage to let go, to release the weight he has carried for so long. And in that moment, he makes a promise to himself. He will no longer allow anger to control his life. He will no longer be a slave to his own resentment. Instead, he will learn to let go, to forgive, not for others, but for himself, so he can finally begin to truly live. As the days passed at the monastery, our protagonist began to feel a subtle but powerful change within himself. He had already learned to recognize the devastating effects of desires and attachment, and had begun to understand the importance of taking responsibility for his actions. He was also working to release the anger and resentment he had carried for so long. However, there was a persistent unease, something he could not define, but the monk seemed to have noticed. One silent morning, as the man meditated in the garden, the monk approached and sat beside him, his presence as light as the breeze passing through the trees. After a long silence, The monk spoke, his voice soft and calm. "There is something that still binds you, something that poisons your mind without you realizing it. Let's talk about your ego." The man looked at the monk, confused. "My ego?" he asked. "Yes," replied the monk. "That inflated sense of self that constantly whispers that you are better or worse than others, that you deserve more, or that you must protect yourself at all costs. That voice is the source of much of your suffering." The man listened carefully, trying to understand what the monk meant. "But what's wrong with having a sense of self?" he asked, puzzled. "If I don't know who I am, how can I live?" The monk smiled, a smile full of compassion and understanding. "There is nothing wrong with having a sense of self, but the problem arises when that sense of self becomes armor, a prison. The ego, my young friend, is like a mask you wear to protect yourself, but it eventually starts to suffocate you. You become so identified with that mask that you forget who you really are behind it." As they walked, the monk pointed to an old tree in the center of the courtyard. "Look at this tree," he said. "It is strong, rooted, and needs nothing but to be what it is. It doesn't compare itself to other trees, doesn't wish to be taller or fuller. It simply is. But the ego, on the other hand, is always searching for something more, always comparing, always desiring, always fearing. And in that process, you lose yourself." The man began to reflect on the monk's words. He remembered all the times he had compared himself to others, how his sense of worth depended on his position, his success, how others saw him. He realized that he was constantly trying to protect an image of himself that, deep down, he knew was fragile. And the more he clung to that image, the weaker he felt, as if he were trying to hold sand in his hands. "When you cling to the ego," the monk continued, "you become vulnerable to any criticism, any failure, anything that threatens that image you've created. And that makes you weak because your strength is not based on who you truly are, but on the illusion you try to maintain. That's why the ego is so dangerous. It convinces you that it's protecting you when, in fact, it's slowly destroying you." The man felt a chill down his spine. He had never thought of his ego in this way. But now, listening to the monk, he began to see how his life had been shaped by that internal voice, always wanting more, always fearing less, always comparing, always defending. He began to understand that true freedom, true strength, could only be found if he learned to let go of that mask, to set aside that armor that had become a prison. "So, what should I do?" he asked, feeling a mix of fear and hope. The monk stopped walking and looked directly into the man's eyes with an intensity that seemed to penetrate all layers of his soul. "You must start asking yourself, who am I really beyond all these stories I tell myself? When you begin to disentangle yourself from these stories, from these comparisons, you will discover an unshakable strength that does not depend on anything external. And when you find that strength, nothing can shake you, because you will know that who you truly are is beyond any illusion." The man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of these words. He knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. He was ready to start unmasking the illusions that kept him trapped, ready to discover the true strength that was within him, beyond the ego, beyond comparisons, beyond all the stories he had told himself. And with that, he took another step toward the freedom he so desperately sought. With each lesson the monk shared, our protagonist felt his mind expand, as if each word was a key unlocking doors long closed within himself. But there was one door he still couldn't fully open, one that seemed always locked at the back of his mind, preventing him from fully living in the present. It was on a foggy morning, as they meditated together atop a hill, that the monk decided to address this issue. Sitting in silence, enveloped by the soft mist covering the mountains, the monk asked, "Have you ever noticed how the mind tends to wander? One moment you're here, the next you're reliving a memory from the past or anticipating a future event. Have you ever wondered why this happens?" The man, his eyes still closed, reflected on this question. He thought about all the times he found himself trapped in thoughts about the past, reliving mistakes, grudges, moments he wished he could change but couldn't. And also the times he got lost in worries about the future, imagining scenarios, anticipating difficulties that might never happen. He realized that much of his life had been lived anywhere but in the present moment. The monk continued, his voice slicing through the silence like a soft blade. The past is like a shadow. No matter how fast you run, it will always be there behind you. But it is a shadow that cannot be touched, cannot be changed. Similarly, the future is like a mirage in the desert. It seems so real, so tangible, but when you try to grasp it, it disappears, leaving only sand in your hands. And so, by fixating on these shadows and mirages, you lose what is real, what is right in front of you, the present. The man felt these words as a soft but precise blow to his heart. He began to realize how he had spent so much time trying to adjust the past, even knowing it was impossible, and how he worried incessantly about what was to come, sacrificing the only moment he truly possessed, the now. Living in the past or the future, the monk said, is like trying to walk in two opposite directions at the same time. You go nowhere. You only stretch, wear yourself out until you break in half. But when you learn to live in the present, when you accept that the past is gone and the future hasn't arrived yet, you find a balance, a peace that cannot be shaken. The man opened his eyes and looked around. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the valley below, the mountains in the distance, and the sky slowly opening up. He felt the fresh air in his lungs, the warmth of the rising sun on his skin, and for the first time in a long time, he was completely present. There was no regret for the past, no anxiety for the future, only the now, pure and simple. But how can I do this? He asked, still struggling to fully comprehend. How can I stop my mind from going to the past or the future? The monk smiled with a calm wisdom in his eyes. The answer is not to stop, but to observe. When you notice that your mind is wandering, don't force it back. Just observe. Acknowledge that you are in the past or the future, and gently bring your attention back to the present. Do this again and again, and soon you'll see that the present is a much more pleasant place to be. It is where life truly happens. The man felt a lightness grow within him. He realized that the present was not just a place of passage, a path between the past and the future, but the destination itself. And in that moment, he made a decision. He would practice being present at every moment, in every breath, in every beat of his heart. He would let the past rest and the future reveal itself when the time came. Everything he needed was here now, and so, sitting on that mountaintop, surrounded by the calm of the dawn, he experienced something new. The feeling of being truly alive, not trapped in what has been or anxious about what will come, but present, whole, and at peace. As our protagonist's spiritual journey progressed, he began to notice subtle but profound changes in his perception of the world. He was more present, more aware, and his mind was beginning to free itself from the shackles that had bound it for so long. However, there was an insidious habit that still needed to be faced, a poison he had ingested for years without even realizing it: the destructive power of words. One afternoon, as they walked through the monastery's silent corridors, the monk led him to a small courtyard where a tree bloomed amid the tranquility. The monk bent down and picked up a fallen leaf from the ground, holding it between his fingers before turning to the man. "Have you ever thought," the monk said softly, "about the power your words have? Like this leaf, your words can be light and beautiful, but when misused, they can become something much sharper and more dangerous." The man frowned, trying to understand what the monk was getting at. He had always considered his words as simple tools for communication, nothing more. "My words?" he asked, confused. "I've always tried to be honest and direct. How could they be dangerous?" The monk looked at him with an expression of serene wisdom. "The words you choose, even those said without thinking, carry a weight that you often do not realize. Every word you cast to the wind is like a seed, and where it falls, something can grow. It could be a flower, or it could be a thorn." The man remained silent, thinking about all the times he used words to express his frustration, his anger, or simply to fill the silence. He remembered conversations that, instead of bringing clarity or comfort, left wounds and resentments. He thought about the times he spread rumors or engaged in gossip without considering the consequences. Until that moment, He had never considered that each of these words might have left indelible marks on the people around him. When you engage in gossip, the monk continued, or when you use words to hurt, manipulate, or deceive, you are not only harming others. You are contaminating your own mind. Speech is a direct manifestation of your thoughts. If you pollute it, the negativity not only leaves you, but also returns, creating a cycle that poisons your soul. The man began to feel a weight in his chest, as if every word he had carelessly spoken was coming back to haunt him. He had never realized how his words, even those he considered insignificant, could have caused so much harm, both to others and to himself. "Silence," said the monk, with a tone that seemed to echo off the courtyard walls, "can be a powerful practice. But more importantly, you must learn to speak with intention, with compassion, and with truth. This does not just mean avoiding lies, but also being careful with what you choose to share. Does what you're about to say bring peace? Does it bring understanding? Or does it create divisions, misunderstandings, and pain?" The man felt a wave of regret, but also a new determination. He realized that he needed to be more conscious, more careful, not only with his actions but also with his words. He began to understand that the path to inner peace and a strong mind lay not only in what he did, but also in what he said. And there, in that small courtyard, he made a promise to himself. He would pay more attention to his words, choosing each one with the intention of creating harmony, not conflict, of sowing understanding, not discord. He knew he couldn't change the past, but from that moment on, he could start planting new seeds, seeds of kindness, truth, and peace. With this new awareness, he began to speak less and listen more. He let go of gossip and empty conversations, and when he did speak, his words were filled with meaning, as if each one was a gift to those who received them. And so, slowly, he began to feel the change within himself. A clearer mind, a lighter heart, and a soul more at peace. As time passed at the monastery, our protagonist began to feel he was becoming a different person. He had already learned the importance of observing his thoughts, the delicacy needed in using words, and the weight of the responsibilities he carried. But there was one practice the monk insisted was essential for his complete transformation, a practice that, no matter how hard he tried, he had not yet mastered: meditation. One morning, the monk took the man to a special place, a small temple atop a hill where one could see the entire valley below. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the silence was deep, almost palpable. They sat on the stone ground in front of a simple altar, and the monk, in his serene voice, began to speak. "The mind," said the monk, "is like a restless monkey, always jumping from one branch to another, always moving, always searching for something. And so, it never finds peace. Meditation is the practice that teaches us to calm this monkey, to find the center of our own mind, where true peace resides." The man listened attentively. He had tried to meditate several times since arriving at the monastery, but his mind always seemed to resist. Thoughts arose like a current, dragging him from one side to the other, and he found himself lost in daydreams, unable to really focus. "I try," he said, "but my mind just won't stop. It seems impossible." The monk smiled, a smile that conveyed understanding and patience. "It's natural," he said. "At first, the mind resists because it is used to chaos. But like any other skill, meditation requires practice, persistence, and above all, patience with yourself. It's not about forcing the mind to be still, but about allowing it to find its own way to stillness." The monk paused, looking at the horizon where the sun continued to rise slowly. Imagine your mind is a lake. When you throw a stone, the waves spread across the surface. Your thoughts are those stones, causing ripples that disturb the peace of the lake. Meditation is not about eliminating the stones, but about allowing the waves to calm naturally until the lake returns to its original serenity. The man closed his eyes, trying to visualize his mind as a lake. He saw himself throwing stones, one after the other, each representing a thought, a worry, a memory. He realized he was always in motion, always searching for something, even during meditation. And then he tried something different. Instead of fighting the thoughts, he simply let them come and go, observing them as if he were sitting on the shore of the lake, waiting for the waters to calm. Minute by minute, he began to feel a change. The current of thoughts was still there, but it no longer dominated him. He was aware of them, but no longer attached to them. And there, in that small temple, with the sun now shining over the valley, he experienced a glimpse of the peace the monk described, a feeling of clarity, of lightness, of being present, fully present, without being pulled to the past or the future. The monk watched in silence, seeing the man delve deeper into his practice. Meditation, he finally said, is the path to the fortress of the mind. It is what allows us to see beyond the illusions of the world, beyond distractions, to the simple truth that is always present. But this truth can only be seen with a calm mind, a mind that is no longer a prisoner of its own thoughts. The man slowly opened his eyes, feeling a serenity he had never felt before. He knew this was just the beginning, that the practice of meditation would require discipline and dedication, but he also knew that from that moment on, he was on the right path. He had found a powerful tool, one that not only strengthened his mind, but connected him with a deeper, truer part of himself. And so, in that silent temple, he made an inner vow. He would practice meditation every day, not as an obligation, but as a way to reconnect with his own essence, to calm the lake of his mind, and to discover the peace that had always been there, waiting to be found. And with this practice, he knew his mind would become stronger, clearer, and more at peace with the world around him. As the practice of meditation became a fundamental part of his daily routine, our protagonist began to experience a mental clarity he had never felt before. He was more present, more at peace, and his once turbulent mind was now more serene. However, there was a persistent challenge, a battle he still couldn't fully conquer: distraction. One afternoon, while walking through the monastery gardens, he noticed how his mind still tended to wander, even during moments of meditation. He observed how, despite his efforts, his attention was often pulled in various directions: a distant sound, a sudden memory, a random thought. He was aware that these distractions weakened his practice, but he didn't know how to overcome them. The monk, observing the man's internal struggle from afar, approached with his calm and measured steps. "You seem troubled, young man," he said with a tone of kindness. "It's as if my mind can never stay quiet for long," the man confessed, frustrated. "Even when I'm trying to focus, something always pulls it away. How can I maintain focus? How can I stop this constant distraction?" The monk nodded as if he had expected this question. "Distraction," he began, "is like an invisible current that pulls us away, even when we think we are anchored. In a world so full of stimuli, it's natural for your mind to be drawn to everything around it. But true mental power comes from the ability to recognize this current and choose not to be dragged by it." The man pondered these words, feeling the weight of truth in them. "But how do I do that?" he asked, eager for an answer. The monk bent down and picked a small flower from the ground, holding it between his fingers. "Look at this flower," he said. "It's small, simple, yet it is here, present in the moment, without worrying about what happens around it. It blooms, fulfills its purpose, without being distracted by storms or strong sun. It is entirely dedicated to being what it is." He handed the flower to the man, who held it carefully. "When you are distracted," the monk continued, "it's as if your mind is trying to bloom in 1,000 different directions at once. But true strength lies in choosing one direction and dedicating yourself to it with all your being, like this flower. That is focus." The man looked at the flower, understanding what the monk was trying to say. He realized that his distractions were like small detours, each seeming important at the moment, but ultimately pulling him away from what truly mattered. He understood that to strengthen his mind, he needed to learn to cultivate mindfulness, to be fully present in what he was doing without allowing his mind to scatter. "Focus," said the monk, "is not about forcing your mind to fixate on something, but about allowing it to find rest in the present moment without clinging to anything that comes to disturb it. This requires practice, patience, and above all, a clear intention." Always ask yourself, what is most important now? And then give yourself completely to that. With these words, the man began to see his distractions in a new light. He understood that they were inevitable, but that he had the power to choose how to react to them. He decided that from that moment on, he would practice being present in every action, every thought, every moment. If his mind began to wander, he would gently bring it back without judgment, but with a firm determination to keep his focus on what really mattered. And so, he began to work on his practice with renewed determination. He noticed the distractions, but instead of getting lost in them, he recognized them and let them go, like leaves floating in a river. He became more conscious, more centered, and over time, mentally stronger. His mind, once so restless, was now beginning to find a state of calm and clarity where he could fully dedicate himself to whatever he was doing. With this new skill, he realized he was getting closer and closer to the true inner peace he sought. He had learned to cultivate focus, to be present, and to let go of the distractions that had kept him away from himself for so long. And with that, he took another step toward the mental strength that had always been within him, waiting to be discovered. The monastery, with its deep silence and towering mountains, had become a refuge for our protagonist, a place where he was finally learning to reconnect with himself. However, there was one last lesson the monk knew he needed to face, perhaps the most challenging of all. A lesson about fear, that subtle but powerful feeling that, without us realizing it, paralyzes us, prevents us from moving forward, and weakens our mind and spirit. One night, when the sky was dotted with stars and the full moon illuminated the valley with a silvery light, the monk invited the man for a walk outside the monastery's limits. They walked in silence, climbing a narrow trail that led to an elevated viewpoint. The air was fresh, and the distant sound of a stream could be heard in the background. When they reached the top, the monk stopped and looked at the vast horizon before them. "There is something we all try to escape from," the monk said, his voice almost a whisper in the quiet night. "Something we often avoid facing, even when it is always present, like a shadow that follows us. Do you know what I'm talking about?" The man reflected for a moment, and then, almost in a whisper, replied, "Fear." The monk nodded slowly. "Yes, fear. It is a silent but relentless force. It hides in the corners of our mind, whispers to us in the darkest hours, and convinces us that we are small, weak, incapable. It stops us from trying, from changing, from growing. And the most dangerous thing is that we often don't realize how much we are under its control." The man looked at the sky, feeling the weight of the monk's words. He knew that fear had been a constant companion in his life. The fear of failure, the fear of not being enough, the fear of losing control. He remembered all the times he avoided making a decision, trying something new, following his heart, all because of fear. And now, with everything he had learned, he realized how fear had weakened his mind, his determination, his very soul. "Fear," the monk continued, "is like a mist that spreads, obscuring your vision. It makes things seem bigger, scarier than they really are. But here is the truth. Fear is an illusion. It only has power over you if you believe in it, if you allow it to dictate your actions." The man felt a chill down his spine, but it wasn't just the night air. It was the realization that for so long he had let fear rule his life. He had hidden behind excuses, justifications, all fueled by this invisible force that he now saw clearly. "How do I overcome this?" he asked with urgency in his voice. "How can I stop letting fear control me?" The monk turned to him, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, and said, "You don't need to fight fear because that will only give it more strength. Instead, acknowledge it, accept that it is there, but don't let it decide for you. Take a step forward, even with fear by your side, and over time, you will see that it begins to dissipate like the mist under the morning sun." They stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the vast world before them. The man realized that in all the challenges he had faced, fear had always been present, like an unwanted companion. But now, he was ready to confront it, not with resistance, but with courage. The courage to move forward, to continue his journey, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. Courage, the monk said softly, is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something is more important than fear. When you find that strength within yourself, nothing can stop you. Your mind becomes unshakable, your soul indomitable. The man took a deep breath, feeling a new determination grow within him. He knew that fear would still be there, whispering its doubts, trying to convince him to stop. But now he also knew that fear was not invincible. It could be faced, it could be overcome, and it would no longer rule his life. And so, on that moonlit night, atop a hill in the heart of Nepal, the man made a promise to himself. He would no longer let fear decide for him. He would walk forward, no matter what came, with a stronger mind, a braver heart, and a soul that was finally beginning to free itself from the invisible chains that had bound it for so long. With this decision, he felt lighter, freer than ever. And as they descended the hill back to the monastery, he knew that the true journey was just beginning. A journey where fear would be only a shadow, and no longer the path he chose to follow. After facing his fears and discovering a new inner strength, the man began to feel that he was truly transformed. The monastery, with its serenity and wisdom, had become a home for his soul in search of peace. But there was one last lesson, a practice he knew was essential to consolidate everything he had learned: meditation. The monk, realizing that his apprentice was ready for this final challenge, led him to a special room at the heart of the monastery, a place where few had access. The room's walls were simple, adorned only with a few ancient tapestries, and in the center was a solitary cushion positioned under a beam of light gently entering through a small window. The atmosphere exuded a deep peace, as if the very air was infused with silence and contemplation. "What do you see here?" asked the monk, his voice low, almost blending with the surrounding silence. The man looked around and replied, "Just a simple place, but there's something more. It's as if this place has a different energy, more intense." The monk nodded. "This is the heart of the monastery, the place where generations of monks have come to meditate and find inner peace. Here, time seems to stop, and the mind can finally rest in its true nature. But for this, you must be prepared to face not only external challenges, but also the internal ones, the distractions, the fears, the doubts that may still arise." The man felt a chill, not of fear, but of anticipation. He knew this would be the final test, the moment when he could test everything he had learned. "I'm ready," he said with a firmness he hadn't known he possessed. The monk observed him for a moment before approaching and placing a hand on his shoulder. "Meditation," he began, "is not just a practice. It is a path. It is the art of silencing the mind so you can hear the inner voice that speaks louder than any other. It is where you confront the shadows and find the light. But remember, it's not about trying to control your thoughts, but rather about observing and letting go. It's about finding the center of your mind, that place where peace resides regardless of the chaos around." With these words, the monk left him in the room, closing the door behind him. The man sat on the cushion, crossed his legs, closed his eyes, and began to breathe deeply. At first, his mind, as usual, began to wander. Thoughts about the past, about the future, small, everyday worries. Everything seemed to want to invade that moment of silence. But he remembered the monk's words, and instead of fighting these thoughts, he just observed them, like clouds passing through the sky. Minutes passed, and something began to change. The current of thoughts began to slow down. He felt as if he were descending an invisible staircase, deeper into his own mind, where the noise of the outside world could not reach him. There was a clarity, a calmness he had never experienced before. But then, as a final test, a wave of doubts arose. What if all this is an illusion? What if, in the end, nothing changes? What if I fail? These thoughts came with force, trying to knock him down, trying to convince him that all his effort had been in vain. He felt the tension grow in his body, but instead of succumbing to panic, he did what the monk had taught him. He observed the thoughts, acknowledged their presence, and then, with a deep breath, he let them go. And in that moment, he felt something break inside him. as if an invisible chain that had held him for so long finally dissolved. The room was in complete silence, but within him, there was a peace so deep, so vast, that it seemed to engulf everything else. He felt as if he had finally found the center of himself, that place the monk had described, the heart of the mind, where there is no fear, no doubt, only a quiet and constant presence. He stayed there in that state of peace for a time he could not measure. There were no more distractions, no more turbulent thoughts. There was only the now, pure and simple. When he finally opened his eyes, he felt as if he had emerged from a deep, restorative sleep. But he knew it was not just rest he had found. It was true clarity, true inner strength. When the monk returned to the room, he saw in the man's eyes that the transformation was complete. "Now you understand," said the monk with a serene smile. "Meditation is not just a refuge. It is a force. It is the place where you find the true essence of who you are, beyond all masks, beyond all illusions." The man stood up, feeling lighter, stronger, more alive than ever. He had found what he sought, not in some external place, but within himself. And with this discovery, he knew he was ready to face the world, no longer as someone lost in distractions, but as someone who had found the center of his own existence. And so, he left that room, not as the man who had entered, but as someone transformed, someone who had finally found the way to true inner peace. Here we come to the end of this spiritual journey based on these 10 Buddhist teachings. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications. Share with your friends and leave your comments below about what you thought of this story or suggestions for a topic you would like to see here. We always bring inspiring stories with teachings for modern life.